The courtroom felt too clean, too calm for what was happening inside my chest. The air was still, heavy with expectation, and every sound seemed sharper than it should have been. The slow clicking of the clock on the wall echoed like a countdown. My mother sat 2 rows ahead of me, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. My father leaned slightly toward her, relaxed, confident, as if this was a meeting they had already won. Their attorney looked even more comfortable, legs crossed, shoulders loose, tapping an expensive pen against a leather folder with lazy assurance. They believed this moment belonged to them. I kept my gaze forward, my face calm, my hands resting quietly in my lap. No one in that room would have guessed how much history had led to this silence. To them, I was just a young woman accused of being incapable. To me, this was the final chapter of a story that began long before any inheritance, long before any courtroom. I grew up in a house where control never raised its voice. There were no slammed doors or bruises to point at. Instead, there were rules disguised as concern, expectations framed as love. My parents believed they knew what was best for everyone, and disagreement was treated like a personal flaw. Obedience earned approval. Questioning earned lectures. My older brother understood this early. He mirrored their opinions, followed their advice without hesitation, and stayed within the boundaries they set. In return, he received constant support and praise. He was dependable, sensible, safe. I was none of those things. I asked why. I asked how. I noticed when rules changed depending on who benefited. Each question was met with a sigh, a warning look, or the familiar phrase, "because we said so." Over time, curiosity turned into defiance in their eyes. I became headstrong, then ungrateful, then finally irresponsible. The label settled over me like a permanent stain. When I took a part-time job after school, they said I was neglecting my studies. When I saved my earnings instead of spending them, they said I was naive about money. When I talked about moving out one day, they laughed as if I had told a joke. My father liked to remind me that the world was unforgiving and that independence was a fantasy for people who didn't understand reality. I listened. I just didn't obey. At 19, I packed my life into 2 suitcases and left. Not dramatically, not in anger. I left quietly because staying meant slowly disappearing. I rented a tiny apartment with thin walls and unreliable heating. I worked long shifts, studied late into the night, and learned quickly how expensive freedom could be. There were days I ate the same meal twice because it was cheap and filling. There were nights I fell asleep exhausted but proud. What I learned most during those years wasn't just discipline, it was restraint. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped sharing plans that would be criticized before they were understood. Silence became my shield. My parents assumed I was failing. They spoke about me to relatives with pity wrapped in concern, predicting I would return home humbled and desperate. I never corrected them, letting them believe that was easier and safer. They never knew about the savings account I opened with my first steady paycheck. They never knew about the freelance work I did late at night, or the hours I spent learning about budgeting and investing. They never knew how carefully I planned each step forward. The only person who ever truly saw me was my grandmother. She noticed how I listened more than I spoke, how I watched people, remembered details, learned quietly. She once told me that the quiet ones in a family often understand more than anyone realizes. When her health began to fail, I was the one who showed up without being asked. I drove her to appointments, organized medications, and sat with her during long afternoons when fear crept into her voice. One evening, when her strength was fading, she said something that changed the course of my life. "They will fight over what I leave behind," she whispered, "and they will try to control you to get it." It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. Together, we planned carefully. Everything was done legally, thoroughly, and quietly. She wanted her wishes protected, not negotiated. She trusted me because I never tried to take anything, only to protect what mattered to her. When she passed away, the reading of the will stunned the room. Her inheritance went to me, not my parents. Not my brother, me. No one spoke. My parents didn't even look in my direction. They exchanged glances instead, and in that moment, I knew something had shifted. I had crossed a line they never expected me to reach. At first, they pretended everything was normal. My mother called daily, her voice soft with concern. My father suggested meetings, offering advice wrapped in gentleness. Then the warnings began. Money like that was dangerous. I was too young, too emotional. They offered to help manage it, temporarily, of course. I refused. The kindness vanished overnight. Their questions became accusations. Their concern turned sharp. They reminded me of everything they had done for me, framing my independence as betrayal. When I refused again, the truth finally surfaced. 2 weeks later, I was served court papers. They weren't asking for guidance. They were asking the court to declare me financially incompetent. They claimed I was unstable, reckless, incapable of managing my own life. They requested control over my accounts, my property, and my future. They even claimed family money had helped me purchase my home, an outright lie. That cut deeper than anything else. As I read the petition, my hands didn't shake. I felt something solid form inside me. This wasn't about money. It was about power. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Revenge isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with threats or raised voices. Real revenge is quiet, deliberate, and patient. It waits until the moment when the truth can no longer be denied. I didn't confront my parents after receiving the court papers. I didn't call to demand explanations or plead for understanding. I understood something essential then. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved with conversation. This was a calculated attempt to take back control they believed had been stolen from them. So I prepared. I hired an attorney known not for dramatic courtroom performances, but for precision. She listened more than she spoke, her eyes sharp, her questions exact. I didn't bring excuses or emotional arguments. I brought evidence, organized folders, bank statements, pay stubs, investment records, property documents, years of quiet discipline laid out in chronological order. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "They've underestimated you for a very long time." She was right. Years earlier, when my grandmother's health had begun to decline, I had taken steps that no one else knew about. With her consent and guidance, I had helped structure her assets in a way that protected her intentions. After her death, I went further. I established legal boundaries between her inheritance and my personal finances. Everything was documented, registered, and sealed long before my parents ever considered legal action. By the time they filed their petition, the ground beneath their argument no longer existed. The weeks leading up to the hearing were tense but strangely calm. My parents stopped calling. Word reached me through relatives that they were confident, even relieved. They believed the court would restore what they thought was the natural order. Parents in control? Child corrected. They didn't know me as well as they thought they did. On the morning of the hearing, I arrived alone. No dramatic entrance. No entourage. I dressed simply, professionally. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to be understood. My parents arrived early, carefully dressed in soft, respectable colors. They wore concern like a costume. Their lawyer greeted the judge with familiarity, as if the outcome were already decided. When proceedings began, he spoke first. He described me as impulsive and defiant. He painted my independence as emotional instability. My refusal to surrender control, he argued, was proof that I couldn't be trusted with responsibility. He spoke smoothly, confidently, relying on assumptions rather than facts. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My father sighed deeply at strategic moments, the picture of long-suffering concern. Then the judge asked for documentation. One by one, the narrative began to crack. The judge read slowly, methodically. Savings accounts opened years before the inheritance. Employment records showing consistent income. Credit reports with no missed payments. A vehicle purchased outright, registered solely in my name. The courtroom grew quieter. Then the judge paused. He adjusted his glasses and looked more closely at a document in front of him. "This residence," he said, "is not leased." My mother stiffened. "It is a purchased property," the judge continued. "Paid in full." The attorney's confidence faltered. Papers were shuffled. Explanations were attempted. The judge wasn't finished. He moved on to investment accounts. Long-term planning, diversified assets. Careful, conservative decisions made over time. Each page contradicted the image they had tried to sell. And then he reached the trust. The judge stopped reading. "This trust," he said carefully, "was established prior to the deceased's passing." He looked directly at me. "And it was created by the respondent." I stood when prompted, my voice steady as I explained. I spoke about my grandmother's wishes, about protecting her legacy from conflict and manipulation, about planning not out of greed but out of respect. My attorney then submitted the final piece of evidence, a recording. The sound of my parents' voices filled the courtroom. There was no anger in their tone, only calculation. They spoke about taking control, about selling assets, about teaching me humility, about making sure I learned my lesson. No one interrupted. When the recording ended, the judge closed the file slowly. "This petition," he said firmly, "is denied." He didn't stop there. "Dismissed with prejudice." The words echoed in the room like a final verdict, not just on the case, but on the story they had tried to tell about me. In the hallway afterward, my parents finally looked at me. Not with anger, with disbelief. Their certainty had collapsed, and they didn't know what to replace it with. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said calmly. "I did it because you tried to control something you didn't earn." They had no response. That night, I returned to my apartment, the one they had tried to take from me, and sat alone in the quiet. The fear that had followed me since childhood was gone. In its place was something stronger. Clarity. I had never been irresponsible. I had simply refused to live under someone else's authority, and now there was nothing left for them to take. In the days that followed the hearing, the world didn't change dramatically. There were no apologies, no late-night phone calls filled with regret. My parents didn't suddenly become different people. What changed was quieter, but far more powerful. For the first time in my life, their opinions no longer carried weight. The court's decision was final, but the emotional aftermath lingered. Relatives reached out cautiously, their messages awkward and indirect. Some asked how I was holding up. Others hinted that maybe things didn't need to be so extreme. I listened, thanked them for their concern, and said very little. I had spent years explaining myself. I was done now. My parents tried once more, weeks later. A carefully worded message arrived from my mother, filled with phrases like family unity and moving forward. It didn't mention the lawsuit. It didn't acknowledge the lies. It didn't include an apology. It was an invitation to pretend nothing had happened. I didn't respond. Silence, I had learned, wasn't avoidance. It was a boundary. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. I returned to work without the constant tension coiled in my chest. I slept better. I made decisions without anticipating criticism that would never come. The inheritance, once a source of conflict, became what my grandmother had intended it to be, a tool for stability, not power. I honored her wishes carefully. Some of the money went into long-term investments. Some supported causes she cared about. A portion I set aside, not for indulgence, but for security. Freedom wasn't about spending recklessly. It was about knowing I would never have to beg for control over my own life. Occasionally, memories surfaced. Moments from childhood that made sense only in hindsight. The subtle discouragement, the way praise was used as leverage, the way independence was treated as rebellion. I realized then that my parents hadn't feared my failure. They had feared my success without them. That understanding brought an unexpected peace. Their actions were no longer personal attacks. They were reflections of their own limitations. Control had been their language of love because it was the only one they knew. I didn't hate them. Hate would have meant they still mattered in the same way. What I felt instead was distance. Clean, deliberate distance. Months later, I ran into my brother at a family gathering I almost skipped. He looked tired, older somehow. We spoke politely, cautiously. At one point, he lowered his voice and said, "I didn't think you'd win." I smiled, not out of pride, but acceptance. "Neither did they," I replied. For the first time, I saw something like doubt in his eyes. Maybe even envy. He had followed every rule and still lived under permission. I had broken them quietly and walked away free. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window and thought about the word revenge. Growing up, I'd imagined it as something dramatic, destructive, something fueled by anger. I understood now how wrong that was. Revenge wasn't hurting them. Revenge was becoming someone they could no longer control. It was building a life so solid that their attempts to undermine it collapsed under their own weight. It was surviving so thoroughly that the narrative they created about me could no longer exist. I thought of my grandmother then, of her quiet strength, of the way she had trusted me without conditions. She hadn't given me just money. She had given me proof. Proof that someone saw me clearly and believed in what I could become. I carried that belief forward. There were still challenges ahead. Life didn't suddenly become easy, but difficulty no longer felt like punishment. It felt like choice. Every obstacle was mine to face on my own terms. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined the moment in the courtroom when everything shifted. The look on their lawyer's face. The silence when the truth surfaced. Not because it embarrassed them, but because it freed me. I wasn't the reckless child they had tried to define. I wasn't the failure they had predicted. I was the woman they never bothered to understand. And now there was nothing left for them to take. I turned off the lights, locked my door, and stood for a moment in the quiet. The quiet I had once used to survive had become something else entirely. Peace. The story didn't end with applause or reconciliation. It ended with something far rarer. Freedom earned. And that was more than enough.